Hello everybody, and thank you all for joining in today. I'd like to start by thanking the GW4 Water Security Alliance for giving me the opportunity here to share our research with you today. So my main research interests are essentially linking hydrology with meteorology, especially in developing countries. I'm interested in building simple models or environmental models characterizing the key hydrological processes, as well as combining them with field work or field observations. I thought about using this title to try and capture the kind of science fiction aspect of our work. So we have been involved with cosmic ray neutron sensing technology for a little bit over 10 years. And when we talk about that, we typically think of nuclear physics or maybe astrophysics when we mention cosmic rays. But hopefully today I'll convince you there is also this hydrological or environmental side to this technology as well. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge these people here who contributed to our research over the years, particularly my former PhD student Joost Ivema and my current PhD student Daniel Power. Also, two external collaborators is Katya Dimitrova Petrova, who recently finished her PhD from Aberdeen University, and my colleague Martin Schong from UFZ Leipzig. I would also like to acknowledge NERC for funding our main projects, Amused, Bemused, and Mosaic, the EPSRC for supporting our WISE Center for Doctoral Training program, and especially the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, from the United Nations for providing support to disseminate our research to other member states around the globe. I'd like to take some time here, and before I start, I'd like to dedicate this talk to two very important people in my life. I was already sort of prepared to dedicate this talk to my PhD advisor at the University of Arizona, Professor Jim Shuttleworth. So Jim is well regarded as one of the fathers in hydrometeorology and a leading scientist studying evapotranspiration process, especially in the Amazon. So Jim was 75 years when he passed last December. What I was not really prepared here was to actually include my father here, who passed away this last Sunday. So he was actually diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at the age of 30 when I was 1 year old only, and lived with this disease for almost 40 years. So next Friday would have been we would be celebrating his 70th birthday. So I'm forever grateful for both of them in different ways and for different circumstances of my life. So I'd like to dedicate this talk to both of them. So now I'd like to start by asking this question: why do we care about water in the soil? So the reason I'm asking this question is today, as you will see, I will be focusing on soil moisture. But first, I actually need to define what soil moisture actually is. So we typically define soil moisture as the water contained in the unsaturated zone. So in this case, we don't really take into account aquifers and groundwater. We tend to refer to soil moisture in terms of the numerical value in terms of water per cubic meters of total soil. For example, if your soil is 0.30 cubic meters per cubic meters, it simply represents 0.30 cubic meters of water within a 1 cubic meter of soil column. So sometimes we also refer to volumetric water content in percent. So the 0.30 cubic meters per cubic meters would be 30% volumetric. So just to help you from now on to understand the talk. However, an important aspect about soil moisture is that we need to consider also the support volume of the soil when we talk about soil moisture. So in this figure here, for example, one might decide to define a volume representing shallow soils, shown here as the A domain, or maybe a deeper soil domain like in B, or even define what sometimes we call root zone soil moisture, which is typically the soil layer where the soil water is most likely be used by plants. So the interesting thing about soil moisture here is that its volume represents only a tiny fraction in terms of all the compartments in the hydrological cycle. So here's a depiction of a dry earth without any water on it. So if you were to separate all the water from the earth, its volume would look like the big water sphere shown here. All this water here represents both fresh water and seawater. So we know that humans rely mainly on freshwater resources. So from all that water from the big sphere that I'm showing here, only about 2.5% is actually fresh water that we can use more readily. So it is actually represented in this small sphere or small water sphere here that you can barely see. So now, if you look at the small water sphere here that represents only the fresh water available to us, I would like you to try to imagine what only about 3.5% of that volume would look like. So that's actually how much soil moisture we have within the whole hydrological cycle. So it's very tiny, but yet soil moisture is still very important for many environmental processes. So going from the top, going clockwise, we have significant lack of water in soil can lead to severe droughts or changes in soil wetness conditions that can eventually impact the climate and the weather due to land-atmosphere interactions. In addition, the excess of water, so the other extreme in soils, can lead to floods or maybe landslides, or the water that infiltrates can eventually contribute to groundwater recharge. So soil moisture also regulates the energy cycle at the surface. It can control the amount of energy that gets evaporated or transpired by plants from the energy that eventually can warm the air just above the surface. So what we call the sensible heat. This also leads to the more ecological controls related to the health of our natural ecosystems, like forests or in croplands for agricultural production. What are the challenges here when trying to estimate soil moisture? So notice that I'm referring here to estimating soil moisture rather than measuring soil moisture. And that's because measuring soil moisture directly is a very difficult task and nearly impossible to be done routinely. So typically, we measure soil moisture only by removing some soil samples from the site, taking it to a lab, weighing before and after the drying, and get some sense how much water you have. Another way that sometimes we can do to measure soil moisture more directly is to use what's called lysimeters. So lysimeters is a big scale that can keep track of all the water content within a predefined volume. And by doing that, you can actually get a sense of how much soil moisture you have in this predefined volume. So one of the reasons it is challenging to estimate soil moisture has to do with its complex spatial patterns and how heterogeneous soil moisture can be over a region. So this limits our understanding of soil moisture behavior across different scales. This is now even more relevant with the recent developments in the last 10 years or so of what we call the hyper-resolution hydrological and land surface models. So hyper-resolution models here are aimed to operate at a target resolution of 1 square kilometer or even less. And as a consequence, understanding the variability of soil moisture at those scales have now become even more important for these models, especially if you aim to apply these models for water resources management planning over a particular region. So now this diagram here has a lot of information, but I will really walk you through it very slowly. So first of all, the horizontal axis here represents the spatial scale extent ranging from 1 meter to 10,000 kilometers. You'll notice some letters next to the horizontal axis. These letters along the horizontal axis denote some of the hydrological classifications. So for catchment, subwatersheds, watersheds, subbasins, and basins, just for our reference here. The vertical axis shows the corresponding temporal scale or temporal scale extent ranging from about a minute to 100 years. And it's classified into weather, seasonal to interannual, and climate. So if you notice on the horizontal axis now, you see a red rectangle highlighting a target spatial scale for the hyper-resolution models. So you also notice that in this diagram, there are many hydrometeorological processes categorized by their spatial temporal characteristics. So just to give you a few examples here, there are relatively slow processes like groundwater and aquifers that are shown in the near top left of the diagram. So these processes tend to fluctuate on the seasonal to interannual scales and cover a spatial extent relevant to catchments from catchments to subbasins. Now, if you look near the bottom left, you'll see overland flow due to soil infiltration excess. So these tend to be relatively short events from minutes to less than an hour and occur at spatial scales of 10 to 100 meters. You can also identify the top horizontal feature showing that the behavior of annual fluctuation of rainfall and evaporation across a range of spatial scales. Now, I would like you to look at the other horizontal feature in the diagram near the center of the diagram. You will notice that it refers to the diurnal variability of the same rainfall and evaporation fluxes. Notice here that the temporal extent is obviously daily, but the spatial extent is reduced when compared to the annual fluxes. Also, notice near the center of the diagram that the balance between the input from rainfall and loss from evaporation pretty much controls the subsurface storm flow process. So with all this complex diagram here, the key point here is that this near center region in the diagram, with a spatial extent varying roughly between hundreds of meters to a few kilometers in the temporal scale variability ranging from diurnal to monthly, is key for us hydrometeorologists and modelers, especially under this new hyper-resolution modeling framework. So what is the issue here then, if you have all these processes? The main issue here is that up until recently, our available soil moisture estimates will not necessarily match such scales of interest directly. So what I've done here is that I shaded most of the processes here a little bit, and I only highlighting the areas where the two more typical soil moisture estimation methods are available. So starting on the left side, we have point scale sensors, which were originated from agricultural sciences and agricultural engineering applications. So there are actually many types of these sensors, but I'm not going to cover all of them here today. The main point is that these sensors are very localized with typical spatial scales of less than a meter, but you can actually have networks of these sensors that can provide estimates on the order of tens to even hundreds of meters in terms of the spatial scale extent. So they typically record at sub-hourly intervals and monitor continuously for several years and even decades if they last. So in this case, we expect soil moisture dynamics to be controlled by changes in soil texture and soil structure. So what does that mean? For example, if you install a sensor at a particular location and another one only a few meters away from that, the recorded differences between them are likely due to slightly different soil properties, even though they're close to each other. In terms of key hydrometeorological processes here, directly linked to this method, we can relate only to the unsaturated flow dynamics at local scales. Now, I would like you to look at the top right corner of the figure, and you can identify another popular way to estimate soil moisture. So this methodology was mainly promoted by atmospheric scientists initially and relates to the use of satellite remote sensing products. So these estimates cover a much larger spatial domain, and given the time it takes for the satellite to go around the Earth to sample the same location, the measurement frequency is on the order of a couple of days. So in this case, soil moisture dynamics is not controlled by soil texture and property mainly, but is strongly controlled by large-scale features such as frontal systems or land cover patterns. An important point here is that neither of these two typical methods relate directly with the center region or center part of the diagram. That's the surface water balance process of interest in hyper-resolution modeling that I explained before. So this means that we can certainly estimate soil moisture using these two methods, but the controlling factors influencing soil moisture dynamics are still associated with different spatial scales. At that spatial scale in the center domain, in the center of the diagram, between 100 meter and 1 kilometer, we actually expect that mainly changes in topography and land cover patterns to control soil moisture dynamics. So that brings us to the first take-home message here. So despite being small, soil moisture is a key component of the hydrological cycle, but it's very hard to be estimated at relevant scales, especially for hydrometeorological applications. So in this talk, I'll introduce you to a more recent technology which uses cosmic ray neutrons to estimate soil moisture. This technology is recent, but not brand new. It started around 2010 with the establishment of the Cosmic Ray Soil Moisture Observing System, or the COSMOS network in the United States. And actually, I was part of the COSMOS team from the beginning and helped with the design and deployment of this network and in the continental US. So here are some pictures from a few of the sites. We started in the US as part of the COSMOS network. Then our group began to expand outside of the US, which we installed a few sensors in Brazil. And more recently, as part of our NERC Muse project, we were able to establish a very small network of the 3 sites in a farm near Swindon here in the UK. So before showing the examples of how to use the sensor, how does the sensor actually work? So here I'm going to actually keep things very simple. So if you know a lot about nuclear physics, you might actually know a little bit more how this process actually works. But in simple terms, primary cosmic rays, mainly protons, reach the top of the atmosphere and generate cascades of high energy neutrons that collide with atmospheric particles. So every time they collide with the particles, it loses a little bit of the energy. So eventually, when these high energy neutrons reach the soil, low energy neutrons that we call fast neutrons are produced within the soil and near the surface. So some of these fast neutrons in the soil are actually scattered back just above the surface, forming this well-mixed pool of neutrons. So the important point here is that hydrogen atoms play a crucial role here because of their greater ability to stop or slow down those neutrons when compared to all other elements present in the soils combined. So some of these neutrons eventually collide with a special gas contained in a tube of the sensor, which produces an electrical pulse. Every time this pulse is produced, the data logger just records the neutron count. So it's just a counter mechanism. And we count the number of neutrons over a period of time, usually in every hour. And so because we assume this direct relationship between hydrogen content with soil moisture, we expect that wetter soils will essentially trap more of these neutrons into the soil when compared to drier soils. Therefore, as the soils dry, a higher neutron counting rate is expected to be seen from the sensor. So with the observations we had and using neutron particle models, we established this nonlinear and inverse relationship between estimated soil moisture with the neutron counting rate. In this case, the soil moisture is shown as percent volumetric, as I explained before, and the counting rate is normalized by its maximum rate. So 1 is the maximum value you can get. It's important, though, to recognize that hydrogen atoms are not only present in the soil water. There are interactions with other sources of hydrogen, for example, water in biomass or in the atmosphere. But the important point is that we have ways to correct for all these additional sources of hydrogen so that ultimately we isolate the neutron signal to changes in soil moisture only. However, I'm not going to cover these technical details about the sensor today. So because of this well-mixed pool of neutrons forming just above the surface, the horizontal footprint of the cosmic ray neutron sensor has a radius of about 200 meters and a vertical sensing depth varying from 10 to 80 centimeters, depending on the wetness condition of the soil. So with wet soils, the sensing depth decreases a little bit. As the soil gets drier, it actually increases. So this slide shows one of the initial tests we did in the Cosmos as part of the Cosmos network. These are the results for the Santa Rita semi-arid site in southern Arizona. You can see the cosmic ray sensor in the picture, and we have both the cosmic ray sensor, and we also have a network of point scale profiles measuring soil moisture profiles, about 5 to 6 sensors per profile, in about 20 profiles in total installed over an area of about 200-meter radius from the cosmic ray sensor. So the cosmic ray is at the center. And these are shown as the green dots in the figure on the top, just next to the cosmic ray picture. So we calculate the average soil moisture from this network of point scales shown in the bottom figure as the black time series. And we compare that against the time series from a soil moisture time series obtained from the single cosmic ray sensor shown in blue. So in this case, you can clearly see how they compare well from each other. So that gave us confidence on the methodology and also confirms the relatively large horizontal footprint of the sensor. So now let's go back to the scales diagram I showed before and place the cosmic ray sensor on it. So we can see now that the cosmic ray sensor fills the gap between the point scale sensor and the satellite remote sensing products. Also importantly, notice that we can now estimate soil moisture dynamics at the same spatial temporal scales relevant for hyper-resolution modeling applications that I was just discussing before. In addition, we now have a measurement a measurement technology that estimates soil moisture at more compatible spatial scales to traditional flux towers. So this provides us a better link between soil moisture and near surface turbulent fluxes of water, energy, and carbon across multiple biomes in the world. So the second take-home message here is the cosmic ray neutron sensor fills the spatial scale gap between the two main or more traditional soil moisture estimation methodologies and can provide perhaps new insights, especially to this hyper-resolution modeling applications and flux towers globally. Now I'll show you some examples of applications of the cosmic ray sensor from our group. Starting here with the work by my former PhD student, Joost Ivema, who look at the differences in, let's say, the information content coming from the cosmic ray sensor compared with a more traditional point scale sensor. So in this case, we're not comparing against a network of those sensors, but only against a single point scale sensor. So we're trying to compare the difference across scales. So this was done at 12 US Cosmos sites with distinct hydroclimate, soils, and land cover characteristics. So the figure that you see here, if you focus only on the total height of the bar and ignoring the different colors for now, it shows the overall root mean square deviation between both sensors ranked from lowest to the highest. So how similar or not these sensors are, being aware they measure at a different scale, a spatial scale. So the different colors in each, different colors here obtain, essentially, they represent what we've done. We actually decompose this error into three components. The first component is the differences in the mean, or in other words, the systematic biases. The second component is differences in the standard deviation, or most likely the seasonal variability. And the third one has to do with timing, so the dynamics between these two sensors. So you can clearly see that different sites show different contributions to these errors. So they're not exactly the same. It's not only about biases, for instance. Now, on the right, we selected 3 examples to help you visualize how these different contributions show up in the time series. So the top figure is for the Missouri site, the MO on the bar graph, showing most of the contribution coming from systematic biases. The middle figure here is for the Tonzi Range site, the TR on the bar graph, where despite some contribution from systematic biases, the main contribution comes from distinct variability signals between both sensors. By the way, the time series, the gray time series represents the point scale measurement, and the black time series represent the cosmic ray sensors. And the bottom figure is for the Metolio site, the ME on the bar graph, suggesting that neither systematic biases nor variability are the main contributors, but instead the differences in the dynamics of both sensors is the main factor here. So the main point is understanding these differences between the different sensors here, each operating at a particular spatial scale, can be important for field experiments in agricultural applications, or maybe to modelers in general, for example, if they're interested in data simulation or model calibration. So speaking about model calibration, I'm showing you here the results for the Santa Rita site using that same network of point scale sensors. So remember that the average of those 20 or so point scale profiles is consistent with the soil moisture obtained with a single cosmic ray neutron sensor, as I showed before. In this case, I'm not yet showing the soil moisture time series. Instead, I'm showing the actual measured neutron count here. So given that inverse relationship with soil moisture I showed you before, the higher neutrons here correspond to drier soils, and those sudden decreases you see in neutron counts correspond to the soils getting wetter due to isolated rainfall events. So we started here with an uncalibrated land surface model with a default set of soil parameters. So we didn't, just a first guess. We use a simple analytical model that we developed called Cosmic that converts the simulated soil moisture profile from the model to an equivalent neutron count time series. I'm not going to explain or cover Cosmic here today, but the reason we follow this approach is to calibrate directly on the measured quantity, in this case neutron counts, instead of the derived quantity, which is the soil moisture. So this avoids adding some unwanted uncertainties when converting the observed counts to actually the derived product, which is the soil moisture. So the equivalent neutron count from the uncalibrated model is shown in black. And we can clearly see that it does not really compare well with the observations from the sensor. These are shown in green. We then test several thousands of parameter sets with this model, always converted to an equivalent neutron count series, until eventually we get a result as close as possible to the observation. So the calibrated model ultimately is shown here in red, and actually it compares really well with the observation. The important point here that I'd like you to remember is that the soil moisture was not directly used to calibrate the model. And instead, we actually used the measured neutron counts. So the question is, let's have a look and see how the soil moisture profile from the model now compares with this independent soil moisture profile from the network of points I mentioned before. So each figure here shows the evolution of soil moisture in the soil profile. The horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis shows the depth from the surface down to the first 50 centimeters. The shading or the coloring here corresponds to the actual soil moisture values going from dry in red to wet soils in blue. So you can see the color bars on the right. So the top panel shows the soil moisture profile obtained with the uncalibrated model. The bottom panel shows the soil moisture profile now obtained with the calibrated model. And squeezed in between them, you have the observed soil moisture profile that we obtain from the network of those point scale profiles as an average time series. So this is an independent observation. So first, let us compare the uncalibrated model with the observation, so the top and middle panels. So we highlight here two main features that we notice. First, the soil moisture from the model tends to be wetter than the observations. And the second thing we notice is the model suggests a higher infiltration capacity of the soil, with wetting fronts reaching deeper soils when compared to what the observation actually suggests. So now let's compare the calibrated model at the bottom panel here against the observations, which is in the middle panel. So remember again that the calibration was performed on neutron counts, not on soil moisture directly. So with the calibrated model, we can see that both of the issues we highlighted before are mitigated quite successfully. So the soil moisture simulated by the calibrated model at the bottom resembles much more the dynamics shown by the observation. So this example here uses a land surface model. So now here's another example, in this case using a more traditional conceptual hydrological model. This work is part of our collaboration with Aberdeen University and led by Katya Dimitrova-Petrova. So in this study, we have two sets of available observations that can be used to constrain the parameters of this more conceptual hydrological model. We have observed stream flow, and we have soil moisture from the cosmic ray sensor. So in the first experiment, what we do the typical rainfall runoff calibration. That means the model is calibrated against only stream flow observations. So we actually have no knowledge about the observed soil moisture. So in this case, we actually keep a number of the, let's say, the best calibrated models. We actually retain those to also evaluate the uncertainty of the calibration. So on your left here, you see the stream flow time series. And you can see the average of those best models shown in red, so the ensemble mean. And actually compare really well against the observations, which are shown in black. You can also have an idea about the uncertainty range, the gray shaded area associated with the stream flow. And the model seems to have relatively higher, relatively higher uncertainty in the drier low flow periods here. So now let's have a look at the right side, the water storage term. We first notice systematic biases between the average of the models and the observations, so the black and the red line. Also, despite constraining the stream flow uncertainties somewhat well, there's a very high uncertainty in the uncertainty range here seen for the storage, which implies that the calibration did very little to constrain this internal structure of the model or the internal state of the model. So this has negative consequences for water resources management in the catchment because the storage term is inconsistent with the expected in the catchment. So now I'm adding here the two figures in the bottom here and they're similar to the ones above. The exception here that now we're calibrating both using the streamflow observation as well as the water storage information from the cosmic ray sensor. If you look at the bottom left now, there's little difference when comparing the results of the streamflow calibration with the figure on the top. Perhaps the only notable change here is a slightly reduction in the uncertainty range, especially during the dry periods. Now, if you look at the bottom right figure here, you can notice that the calibration in this case was not only successful in terms of predicting the streamflow, but constrains much better the soil moisture here in the model. And there is no significant biases here in a much better identify uncertainty range. So both of these selected examples using models here that I showed highlights the potential benefits of combining models with the cosmic ray sensor. A more recent application of those sensors has been in terms of exploring mobile platforms, and we call these the cosmic ray rovers. Our group here did attempt to build our Bristol rover, and not this one, by combining multiple tubes from our stationary sites. But currently we actually don't own a proper rover. Our idea of adding multiple tubes here is to increase the number of counts over a period of time, which allows for lower uncertainty, especially when you're moving or driving the sensor slowly. I don't have many examples with that because these are just like testing. There's nothing really in terms of publication with our data in the UK. But here's just an example of a survey we made at the farm where we have our stationary sites. This work was done by Martin Schwong from UFZ Leipzig when he came to visit our group back in 2016. So the colors here represent the soil moisture varying from dry in red to wet in blue, and you can see the color bar on the right. So first of all, you notice the spatial variability of soil moisture in our farm. This is just to let you know, the horizontal is about 5 kilometers and the vertical scale here is about 3 kilometers. This is a small farm. Notice also the big red area in the center of the map, and that's actually a large concrete area in the farm that we know is always dry. So things seem to be making sense with our very first survey here. Now, changing a little bit the subject, another important aspect led by our group is this idea of disseminating and training the next generation of users of this technology, both in the UK and also abroad. Here are some examples of field work involving undergraduates, masters, PhD students, and even postdocs in engineering. And in addition, every year we offer projects for undergraduate students and master's students to try and get more used to this new technology here. We have also been working closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency here, at the United Nations, to help us disseminate and facilitate the application of this technology, especially for international development in agriculture and water resources management. So one of these collaborations is with the University of São Paulo in Brazil, facilitated by the IAEA and also supported by our NERC BMUSE project. So the BMUSE project had two main objectives, one involving land surface modeling applications, which I'm not really going to cover here today. The other objective is to apply the cosmic ray sensor in the Cerrado region in southeast Brazil. So the Cerrado region, if you don't know, is the second largest biome in Brazil, or natural biome in Brazil. It is characterized by woody savanna. The natural vegetation in the Cerrado has been converted to crops and pastures at similar, or maybe sometimes even higher rates than the Amazon deforestation. So with the derived soil moisture from the cosmic ray sensor, we have now a long record of soil moisture at one of our sites. So you can see the time series here at the bottom. So the time series here showed the transition from more normal years in the first 2 years or so to much drier conditions, including the 2013, 2015 severe drought. And this drought particularly resulted in major impacts to water resources in southeast Brazil. So the idea now is to combine the soil moisture data from the cosmic ray sensor with a co-located flux tower. By the way, if you can actually spot the person saying hi at the top of the flux tower, is actually me back in 2001 when we installed the tower the first time. So the third take-home message here is there are some initial benefits in combining this new cosmic ray sensor technology with hydrometeorological models and other environmental monitoring platforms. We also believe that dissemination and training are important to ensure the success and also further adoption of this technique in the future. So the last part of my talk will focus on our recent efforts to establish this global cosmos network for the scientific community in general. So up until now, we have identified more than 150 cosmic ray neutron sensor stations globally, which provide data publicly, so they're openly available. And the interesting thing is 10 of those sites also have flux tower co-located to the cosmic ray sensors. This figure here shows a time series of number of publications that use the cosmic ray sensor as the center point of the paper. So these are the blue bars that go up until September 2020. So I haven't really updated that. The red line shows a subset of those publications which actually combine this technology with models. So if you look at the blue bars first, you can see the adoption of this technology has increased since the first publication in 2008, and show here as a relatively steady number of publications every year. However, we notice that the trained publications which combine the models, so in other words, the red line, not necessarily, it hasn't really picked up the same speed. So in simple terms, the community is not yet exploiting these data for modeling applications as much. So in my opinion, this is a bit counterintuitive, as we would have expected modeling applications to have increased more sharply recently as more data are now becoming available. So the main reason is, we believe, is that we, the cosmic ray neutron sensor developers and first users, we have not yet established a common platform to share this data in a more harmonized way, like, for example, other networks such as Ameriflux and FluxNet. And here I use the analogy of a server room. So all the cables are connected and somehow running, but the room is very messy. Imagine trying to make sense of all these connections and systems running in this room. So the Cosmos community have a similar problem. So currently, although these individual networks operate nationally without any major issue, there is a lack of a harmonized approach currently that limits some broader big data analysis from external groups. The bad thing about it is that it recently has led to some incorrect assessments about the quality of this technology, impacting the adoption of the technology, especially by the global modeling groups interested in evaluating their models in a more bigger global context. However, our group here believes that challenges can actually lead to opportunities, and that's how we are actually tackling this problem. So this is the work mainly done by my current PhD student, Daniel Power, also working with Miguel Rico Ramirez in our group in engineering. So Dan has recently developed the cosmic ray sensor Python 2 that we call CRISPy. So CRISPy is an open source data a processing tool for cosmic ray neutron sensors, and is designed to process multiple sites at once in a harmonized way. So in terms of literature, it's up to date to all the developments of the sensor and processing steps associated with the technology. The interesting thing about CRISPy is we already think about metadata analysis. So CRISPy also fully integrates with global databases, both meteorological databases, as well things like soil types, land cover types, and is used for gap filling purposes, as well as for metadata analysis, as I mentioned. And the idea behind CRISPy is also to allow research to happen, but also as a teaching tool to actually bring new users more on board with this technology. So for example, with those 150 plus sites that we already identify, which I show in the global map, this is roughly how they are characterized in terms of land cover on your left and soil types on the right. So you can have an idea already how the subset of sites you can have if you were to categorize in these two classes here. Or alternatively, one can zoom in a particular region or country to investigate the available data. In this case, we're looking at the continental US sites. So with CRISP, we can easily sample these sites or a subset of all the data based on their hydroclimatic regimes here. So this is I show here in terms of mean annual temperature on the figure on the right, the vertical axis, and mean annual precipitation on the horizontal axis. And the different colors you see in the on the figure on the right show the different land covers of those sites in the US. So this allows someone, for instance, to investigate subsets of the data set. Say, for example, if they want to see only a particular land cover class, or maybe focus on a particular hydroclimate regime for better understanding a process, whether it's for understanding the hydrological process or for modeling applications. So our new CRISP tool can contribute to a more cleaner approach towards this harmonized data set for large scale and global applications. So the idea here is that this will eventually increase the adoption of this new technology by the wider scientific community. And what I usually say is, in some ways, we're trying to do some tidying here in this server room. So my final take-home message here is the adoption of the cosmic ray neutron sensor technology has been slow by external communities, and we believe it's because of the lack of harmonization here. And so there is a need for new data processing tools here to harmonize and standardize this data to facilitate this adoption here. So if you don't remember all the 4 take-home messages here, these are the 3 key points I would like you to remember. So soil moisture is an important component of the hydrological cycle, but hard to estimate. Cosmic ray neutron sensors will eventually fill the gap, or the spatial scale gap, between the 2 more typical soil moisture measurement techniques or estimation techniques, and perhaps can provide new insights for hydrometeorological or eco-hydrological applications. And we're actually making efforts to the development of this global harmonized data set, these sensors, hopefully that a wider community can actually start using it. So with that, I'd like to thank WSA again for letting me speak today, and I'm happy to try and answer some questions.